Hi everyone. Hope everybody had a nice holiday period and a happy new year. I hope that 2023 isn't as problematic as we're all anticipating it to be. I've kind of run out of things to talk about here on the channel, and I'm only really doing videos when something pops up that I think's worth putting out there. But I was watching a video on the ancient Canaanites and child sacrifice, and the archaeologist who found some standing stones in Israel and the remains of sacrificed children by the Canaanite Amorites. And it got me thinking about DNA, and they have now discovered that the DNA of the Philistines comes from ancient European or Southern European peoples of the Iberian Peninsula, Portugal, Spain, Italy. So the Philistines were sea people related to these people, and they know this by some baby remains they found and they tested. However, the Philistines go way back to the time of Samson and King David, and they can get genetic samples from the remains and they can identify where these people come from. Yet, nowhere online can I find any information about DNA testing of ancient Hebrew or Israelite DNA. Now, we have several websites that talk about Jews or Jewish DNA or Israelite DNA being linked to Canaanites. We know scripturally that this is wrong, that the Canaanites were descendants from Ham and Canaan. The Israelites were descendants from Shem, and they would have had different DNA or come from a different family tree, even though they were all related to Noah. In this article, we have DNA and the origin of the Jews. Now, we use the term Jew loosely. There were no Jews back in the time of Jesus. Jew is a relatively new term that is used for the people who call themselves Jews. It says, is there a genetic marker of Kohanim, priests, are Ashkenazi Jews descendants from Khazars? Why is there such a close genetic connection between Samaritans and Jews, especially Kohanim? A look at what genetic testing can tell us about Jews. In pre-modern times, the question of where Jews came from had an obvious answer. The Bible tells the story of Israel's origin, beginning with the patriarchs and matriarchs, moving on to Moses and the Exodus from Egypt, and continuing on the conquest of Canaan, the judges, the monarchy, the exile, and so on. Modern scholars have come to challenge the narrative, however, just as scientists began to challenge the creation story in Genesis, looking beyond the biblical account for an explanation of how the Jews came to be. So whereas the earlier parts of the biblical origins narrative, such as the patriarchs or the conquest, have been increasingly understood as mythic among contemporary Bible scholars, the later parts of biblical account, namely the existence of the kingdoms of Israel and Judah, the exile to Babylon, and the re-establishment of Judah in what is known as the Second Temple period, are generally accepted in broad outline as historical facts. And yet, even the connection between Jews and Judea has been challenged over the past few decades. Despite all that they have learned about biblical history, scholars are still seeking to understand the ancient origins of the Jews. Did their Israelite ancestors originate in Mesopotamia, as the book of Genesis suggests? Did they emerge from within the indigenous populations of ancient Canaan, as many biblical scholars now argue? In addition to textual and archaeological arguments, advances in population genetics over the last few decades have paved the way for biological approach to questions of Jewish origin, of when, where, and from what earlier population the Jews arose. So Jewish genes. The redefined ability of biologists to decipher DNA has led to some scientists to attempt to pinpoint the ancestry of Jews and to place those ancestors geographically. This kind of research has been part of an explosion of genetic studies of the Jews in the last 2 decades, much of it driven by medical questions, but some of it focused on historical and genealogical questions. Genetic testing companies such as Ancestry.com, Gene by Gene, and 23andMe have made this kind of research famous, and it has also involved certain ambitious research projects aimed at illuminating the genetic history of the Jews, such as the Jewish HapMap project, co-founded by Harry Osterer and Gil Atzmon, which aims to construct a genetic map of Jewish diaspora populations around the world. The Ashkenazi Genome Consortium, founded by 11 labs in New York and Israel, which sequenced the genome of 128 Jewish individuals of Ashkenazi ancestry as of 2013. These initiatives are meant to aid in the study and treatment of genetic disease, but they also represent new historiographical resources that allow us to learn information about Jews unavailable in textual and archaeological sources. So the Kohanim study, one of the earliest and most famous of these studies, is the study of Kohanim, i.e. Jewish males who identify as members of Judaism's priestly clan. According to the rabbinic Jewish law, members of the Jewish community is based on maternal descent from mother to child, but priestly descent is passed down paternally from father to son. The Torah traces the Kohanim back to Moses' brother Aaron, who passed down the status of his male descendants. Now, we do not know if Aaron actually existed, but there is evidence from Josephus and rabbinic sources that priestly status was transmitted from father to son in the time of the Second Temple and the following centuries. If priestly status has been consistently transmitted through the paternal line, in theory, there should be mutations that have accumulated on their Y chromosomes that sons inherit directly from their fathers. So, discovering the Cohen model haplotype. In 1997, geneticists Michael Hammer and Carl Skorecki and their colleagues tested self-identified Kohanim from Israel, the United States, and Britain to determine whether they shared a distinctive genetic inheritance that tied them to one another as co-descendants of paternal lineage. The focus of their study was to array a haplotypes found on the Y chromosome of their subjects. A haplotype is a group of genes within an organism inherited from a single parent. Haplotypes on the male side tend to mutate at a relatively rapid rate, which means that when two males share a distinctive haplotype in the Y chromosomes, that is a sign that they share a common ancestor on their male side in the relatively recent past. Hammer, Skorecki, and their team discovered that the distinctive haplotype, which they called the Cohen model haplotype, CMH, was present in about half of the self-identifying Kohanim they tested, showing that they shared a common ancestor on their paternal side. And I'm just adding here the similar symbology from the Kohanim symbols and from the British royal family heraldry, which I might add later in a video I'm doing on the British throne and the throne of Jacob. There was no way of identifying who this ancestor was, but since the relevant genetic signature showed up among both Ashkenazic and Sephardic Kohanim, the authors of the study reasoned that this common ancestor must have lived before the split between the two populations that occurred sometime in the mid-1st millennium CE. A later study that was trying to estimate when the mutations that distinguishes the Cohen model haplotype occurred placed this ancestor between 2,100 and 3,250 years ago. Adamantly not a very precise dating, nevertheless, the existence of the CMH along with its dating range were suggestive enough to lead the public to mistake the genetic findings as scientific evidence that Kohanim were descendants from Aaron himself. So, problems of the study. Almost 20 years later, we know that these earlier studies can be challenged. Even their authors have significantly revised their conclusions. The latest study that I have been able to locate from 2014 calls the entire project into question, challenging how the earlier studies dated the mutations and cautioning against the use of haplotype as a marker of any kind of Jewish ancestry. Despite such criticism, there is no denying the impact that the original studies had on the public's perception of such research and on genetics. Our own hopes for what this kind of research could reveal about the Jews. More recent research has shown that the ancestry of the Kohanim themselves is more complex than the earliest studies suggested, reflecting many different lineages that emerged at different points in history. And there is still debate about how to interpret the genetic evidence. But as murky and convoluted as the genetic ancestry of the Kohanim has proven to be, the effort to uncover that ancestry in the late 1990s proved pioneering nevertheless, unleashing curiosity about the ancestry of the Jews in general. As a result, there has now emerged a distinct new subfield of Jewish history, the genetic history of the Jews, that reaches beyond what we can learn from biblical and archaeological sources about the earliest ancestor of the Jews. Jews are from the Middle East. One of the most ambitious of studies to date involved the analysis of a whole genome samples from 14 different Jewish communities representing about 90% of the world's Jewish population. The research was published in 2010 by the Israeli geneticist Doron Behar, together with 20 other contributors. The samples used were compared with genetic samples from 69 neighboring non-Jewish populations, producing the most comprehensive and precise genetic profile of the worldwide Jewish population to date. The study found that genetically, most of the Jews sampled fell into 3 distinct subclusters that were distinguishable from another because each had intermixed with the local population among which it lived. At the same time, it also found that almost all of these different populations had connection to Middle Eastern populations. This suggests that despite being dispersed around the world, Jews do indeed have ancestries that connect them to the Near East, as Jews themselves have long believed. Well, my argument is that this doesn't make them Israelite or Hebrew, and it is a high potential that they could have been Idumean. And as I've tried to prove in my videos, that the Idumean descendants were significant in the Silk Road trading routes and the Spice Kings Road trading route, which gave them the ability to then convert the Ashkenazi Jews from the Ukrainian region. Let's not forget that Esau married Canaanite women and Hittite, but they intermingled with mainly Canaanites, and the translation of the word Canaanite literally means merchant. So this research suggests that it is possible to use a living population's genetic profile to trace its ancestry to a remote place and time. But despite this evidence, not everyone accepts the contemporary Jews go back to a Middle Eastern population. So Jews and a Kaza theory. After the population of Behar's study, the molecular biologist Aaron L. argued quite differently, that the data actually supports the conclusion that Ashkenazi Jews came from the Caucasus Mountains. This seemed to confirm, he argued, what has come to be known as the Khazar theory. The Ashkenazi Jews descend from the Turkic people known as the Khazars, who inhabited the region between Europe and Asia and converted en masse to Judaism during the Middle Ages. The theory goes back to the 19th century, but was made popular in the United States by Arthur Koestler in a 1976 book called The 13th Tribe. It continues to have advocates to this day, including the Ku Klux Klan leader David Duke, who only recently began to question the theory when he realized that its earlier advocates included communist Jews like Koestler. Well, it doesn't matter who believes it, is it true or not? And we find that there's a lot of historical evidence to prove that it is, not only genetic. Historians rely on textual sources have exposed many weaknesses in the Khazar theory, but with Elhake's research, it seemed to find a new scientific footing. The data suggests that Ashkenazi Jews do not descend from Middle Eastern founders, but from a Turkic population in the Russian steppe, as argued by Khazar theory. So Behar and his associates seized on Elhake's analysis as a chance not just to defend their original analysis, but to deepen their research. Behar pointed to the methodological problem with Elhake's analysis. There are no more Khazars alive today, no known Khazar descendants, and no Khazar skeletal remains from which to draw DNA evidence. Hence, there is no way to draw a genetic connection between Ashkenazi Jews and a Khazar population. To overcome this problem, Al-Hilk drew his samples from proxies, Armenians and Georgians, from what he erroneously took to be the region of the Khazaria, and it was on the basis of these samples that he found that 70% of European Jews had, and almost all Eastern European Jews cluster with these populations, and by extension their supposed Khazar ancestors. Well, what about the remains of the cities, the Ukrainian region that was once called Greater Israel? We've got the history of the ruins of Atil, and I've just brought up a page here. The ruins of Atil, Samostelka, Russia, is one of the least remembered and arguably one of the oddest side stories of Jewish history, was the existence of an enormous Jewish state in West Central Asia during the Middle Ages, the Khazar Empire, whose rulers and aristocrats converted to Judaism sometime in the 8th or 9th centuries, may in fact have been the largest Jewish-ruled realm in history, dwarfing both the ancient and modern Israel. It has been theorized that Ashkenazi Jews were descendants in part from Khazars, who had migrated westward into Europe around the 10th and 11th centuries. So about the same time as Yiddish-speaking Jews were migrating eastward from Germany. So they're saying now that the origins of Yiddish is not Germanic, but it's Eastern European. So they converted to Judaism and claimed, wow, this sounds familiar. At some point in the late 8th century AD, Bulan, the ruler of the Khazarians, decided to emulate the rulers of neighboring countries and adopted the God of Abraham, since he viewed Judaism as being the older sibling of Christianity and Islam, and therefore superior to both. And since the Jews at the time had no rival monarch, Bulan converted to Judaism and claimed the throne of David for his own. Is this why the House of Windsor can claim the throne of David as their own? I wonder. Amazingly, this worked. Although the Khazar king was never recognized as David's successor per se, Khazaria was recognized as a Jewish state, the only one to have existed between 135 and 1948 AD. The Jewish Khazar Empire lasted for about 200 years, throughout which time its rulers were in close contact with the important Jewish communities of Mesopotamia and Asia Minor. Toward the end of the 10th century, the Khazar Empire was destroyed in a series of wars against several of its neighbors, notably the newly Christianized Russia. They made their last stand in Crimea in 1016, while some of the Jews of Khazaria remained in the east. The majority seem to have migrated westward into Europe, where they eventually mingled with Jews migrating eastward from Germany. The Khazar capital of Atil, destroyed in the wars with Rus, would be forgotten until its ruins were rediscovered in the late 20th century. Here's a picture of the ruins here. And now we have Zelensky saying he wants Ukraine to become big Israel. And as we know, there's nothing new under the sun. I wish this creep would stop wearing khaki.
Today is a potentially confusing day, but mostly it's exciting. Why? Because this video is being sponsored by 23andMe. 23andMe is named 23andMe because there are 23 pairs of chromosomes in every cell of your body, and they contain all of the genetic information about you. I'm so nervous! I literally think it's gonna be like, it's gonna pop up and be like, you're screwed! It's so weird. I'm 99.7% Ashkenazi Jewish.
Oh my God.
I'm the Jewiest person anyone knows. I mean, whatever it is the Jews were chosen for, I've got it. There is a way based on your DNA from your mom that they can literally trace the migration patterns of where your family went and how many years ago they went there. So we start in East Africa 180,000 years ago. And then it looks like my line branched out, wow, to modern day Saudi Arabia, modern day Iran, and then up into the Caspian Sea. Oh my gosh, that's so cool. Oh, hey now, I have fewer Neanderthal variants than 82% of y'all.
So Behar and his colleagues argued that the use of living Armenians and Georgians as genetic proxies for the Khazars was a mistake, as they hail from the southern part of the Caucasus, whereas the Khazar kingdom was located farther to the north. They sought to correct for this problem by comparing a large collection of Jewish samples with the largest available genome, wide sample set of the various non-Jewish populations from the region where Ashkenazi Jews may have originated, including people from Western Europe, the Middle East, and individuals living in an actual Khazar region north of where Al-Haik took his sample. Their approach led to a very different result, calling Al-Haik's conclusion into question by showing that Ashkenazi Jews share greatest genetic ancestry not with the people from the Caucasus, but with those from Europe and Middle East. Al-Haik has recently published a study to expand on his views, now describing the supposed founding population of Ashkenazi Jews as a Slavo-Iranian confederation. But he has not overcome the findings of Behar or his historians like Charles Stamfer, who dismisses this research as nonsense. Now, it appears to be that there's two lineages from where today's Jews come from. One is a Middle Eastern Levant ancestry, the other is a European or Khazarian ancestry. It may have been that the Khazarian ancestry did originate in Levant, but if we look at May and Balik's ancestry, it says that they went from Saudi Arabia to Iran and then to the Caspian Sea, with no mention of Israel in between or a long-term stay in the region that was the kingdom of North and South Israel. I mean, look at the map here. It's got Saudi Arabia, and the migration from Saudi Arabia to Iran doesn't even need to go through Israel. Is genetic research racist? Well, it appears to be racist when it comes down to discovering who the Jewish people really are. So even as genetics research has taken great strides in the last 20 years, we need to take note of a critique of Jewish genetic research that has developed among historians and anthropologists of science who contest how the evidence is being interpreted, question the motives of those doing this kind of research, and worry that it has dangerous implications as a rationale for new forms of racism. So it's okay to test everybody else's genetics and origins except for the Jewish people. And obviously this is a Jewish website, the Torah.com. So Samaritans, Jews, and Kohanim. In 2013, my Stanford colleague Noah Rosenberg and I edited a special volume of the journal Human Biology that included a genetic study of the Samaritans, a small community in Israel today who claim descent from the northern tribes of Israel. The study revealed genetic connections between Samaritans and Jews, especially Jewish Kohanim. This association suggests that Samaritans and Jews shared a common ancestry in antiquity, just as the Samaritans had long claimed by tracing themselves back to the ancient Israelites. Now, this doesn't mean anything. We know that when the Southern Kingdom came back to Jerusalem, that the Samaritans inhabited the land, and they were people that had moved in from elsewhere who had been planted there by the Assyrians. The Idumean or Edomite people had moved further north. They took over the trading routes that were lost by the Southern Kingdom of Israel, and they were allowed to do this by the Babylonians. Go back and watch some of my videos. There's studies on this, how the Edomites moved north into the realms of Judea or Israel, Southern Kingdom Israel, as the people had been removed. So the Samaritans were not northern tribe people. There may have been some left, but mostly they were a mixture of surrounding nations. So there's no claim just because they match the Samaritan DNA. If anything, it might prove that they have a genetic link to these Idumean people. When I reviewed the Samaritan study, I pointed out to one of the authors, the Stanford genetics Mark Feldman, all these surnames have a bias towards one type of result that the genetic connection between Samaritans and Jews of Coanic descent was open to a different explanation. Josephus, the first century historian, in a narrative that appears in Jewish antiquities, describes how the Samaritans acquired their priesthood. He claimed that in the time of Alexander the Great, 332 BCE, the elders of Jerusalem rose up against the high priest in Jerusalem named Manassas for marrying the daughter of the Samaritan governor, insisting that the priest either divorce his Samaritan wife or give up his priestly role. Manassas chose instead to defect to the Samaritans, accepting appointment as their high priest of their newly built temple at Mount Gerizim. According to Josephus, Manassas wasn't alone in his defection. Many Israelites and priests joined him and married Samaritans. So Feldman and his colleagues believe the genetic connections between Samaritans and Jews affirms the Samaritans' self-understanding as co-descendants from the ancient Israelites. Josephus' reports suggest another potential explanation for the genetic connection between Samaritans and Jewish Kohanim, intermarriage in the Second Temple period rather than common descent from ancient Israelite ancestors. Feldman acknowledged that this theory offered another potential explanation for genetic data he and his colleagues uncovered. I'm not arguing that Josephus' description of the Samaritans is correct, and I want to be especially careful here because the Samaritans are a tiny religious minority in Israel today and have had legal run-ins with the Jewish religious authorities because of the ambiguity surrounding their origins. The Samaritans' self-perception as Israelites may be accurate, or some Samaritans may be connected to the ancient Israelites and others connected to the Second Temple Jews. Perhaps others will suggest additional hypothesis to explain the data. My point is historical sources, as few as they are, allow for more than one way of narrating a genetic history of the Samaritans, such as a situation given gives one pause about drawing conclusions about Samaritan origins from their genetic data. Now in Psalms 137, verse 7 to 9, it says, "Remember, O Lord, the children of Edom in the day of Jerusalem, who said, raise it, even to the foundation thereof. O daughter of Babylon, who art to be destroyed, happy shall he be that rewardeth thee as thou hast served us. Happy shall he be that taketh and dasheth thy little ones against the stones." Now, if we go to the Wikipedia explanation of this verse, it says, the psalm is a communal lament about remembering Zion and yearning for Jerusalem while dwelling in exile during the Babylonian captivity. The psalm forms a regular part of liturgy in Jewish, Eastern Orthodox, Catholic, Lutheran, blah, blah, blah. It has often been set to music and paraphrased in hymns. So basically what Psalms is telling us is that the Edomites razed Jerusalem and infiltrated the land of southern Judea. After Nebuchadnezzar's successful siege of Jerusalem in 597 BC, the subsequent campaigns, inhabitants of the kingdom of Judah were deported to Babylonia, where they were held captive until some time after the fall of Babylon. Psalms 137 is a hymn expressing the yearnings of the Jewish people during the Babylonian exile. And it says, Psalms verse 7 to 9, the psalm ends with a prophetic prediction of violent revenge. Remember, O Lord, the children of Edom in the day of Jerusalem. It says the abhorrence of Esau towards Jacob for tricking him into giving up his share for the inheritance was passed on to their descendants. Edomites and Israelites were such constant enemies that there was an account in the Bible where the Edomites didn't let the Israelites pass through Edom. They tried to conquer the country of Israel during the time of Jehoshaphat but didn't succeed. The Edomites were further mentioned as a nation defeated and invaded by Saul and later by David. They allied with Nebuchadnezzar in invading Jerusalem. Their brutality towards the people of Jerusalem and their cruel actions in destroying the first temple gained criticism from the prophets up to later eras. They fought with Jews many times and became one of the nations conquered by the Maccabees at its peak. Under the leadership of the Maccabees, they were obliged to embrace the Jewish cultures. Their men were circumcised and they were forced to follow the Jewish laws until a time came when they openly mixed themselves with the Jews and did their practices, including paganism. The legendary Herod, who ordered the construction of the Second Temple, was an Edomite. So here it says, after the Assyrians conquered Samaria, they resettled the land with foreigners. Those people intermarried with the Israelites in the region. The foreigners also brought their pagan gods. The Jews accused the Samaritans of idolatry, straying away from Yahweh, and considered them a mongrel race. According to this website, The Bible Journey, it says that in 2 Kings 17:24-41, after the fall of the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BC, people from other parts of the Assyrian Empire, from Babylon, Cutha, Ava, Sepharvim, it sounds a lot like Sephardim, and Hamath, are brought to settle in Samaria to replace the Israelites. And we can see the map. Most of those places are here in Babylon. Cutha, Hamath over here, which sounds like a Canaanite city. It says Samaritans, following the fall of Samaria and the northern kingdom of Israel in 722 BC, all Israelites who were unable to flee elsewhere were deported to Assyria. Settlers from other parts of the Assyrian Empire were brought in to replace them by King Sargon II, who is depicted on a bas relief from Khorsabad that is on display in the British Museum in London. Early on in the resettlement of Samaria, lions attacked and killed some of the new settlers, so one of the exiled priests of Israel was sent back to Bethel to inform settlers how to pacify the God of their new land. He taught the new residents of Samaria how to worship the Lord, the God of Israel, alongside their own gods. In later generations and in Jesus' day, the Samaritans were hated by the Jews because of their mixed Jewish-Assyrian ancestry. Due to their mixture of Jewish and pagan religious practices, they were not considered to be Jews. As a result, the Samaritans built a rival temple in Mount Gerizim, which they believed to be the site of their altar where Abraham prepared to offer his son Isaac as a sacrifice. But this was destroyed in 128 BC. Even today, local Samaritans still offer a lamb as ritual sacrifice on the slopes of Mount Gerizim at Passover time. So it would appear that the Samaritans were part Northern Kingdom Israelite, part Assyrian, but, it says basically that the Assyrians resettled lands with people in their kingdom. Now, their kingdom didn't necessarily mean that they were Assyrian, because they conquered many other people's lands. So, we can see Cutha here, right in Babylon, and which is today's Iraq. We can see Hamath over here on the coast, which would look like a Canaanite region, and the other places aren't marked on here. So it's possible that the Samaritans weren't Idumean or Edomite. It's possible that they mixed with them. We know, as I said, the Edomites raised the city of Jerusalem and moved into the trading routes of the Israelites after they were exiled. So here in the Smithsonian magazine, it says ancient DNA sheds new light on the biblical Philistines. Team of scientists sequenced genomes from people who lived in a port city on the Mediterranean coast of Israel between the 12th and 8th century BC. Sometime in the 12th century BC, a family in ancient port city of Ashkelon, in what is today's Israel, mourned the loss of a child, but they didn't go to the city cemetery. Instead, they dug a small pit in the dirt floor of their home and buried the infant right in the place where they lived. The child's DNA is now helping scholars trace the origins of the Philistines, a long-standing, somewhat continuous mystery. In accounts from the Hebrew Bible, the Philistines appear mostly as villainous enemies of the Israelites. They sent Delilah to cut the hair of the Israelite leader Samson, and thus stripped him of his power. Goliath, the giant slain by David, was a Philistine. Philistine reputation as a hostile, warmongering, hedonistic tribe became so persuasive that Philistine is still sometimes lobbed as an insult for an uncultured or crass person. So it says, but who were the Philistines exactly in the Bible? Ancient cities like Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Ekron were mentioned as Philistine strongholds. In the 19th and 20th centuries, scholars finally started to piece together a distinct archaeological record of Philistine culture. Evacuations revealed that these cities saw the emergence of a new architecture and artifacts at the beginning of the Iron Age around 1200 BC, signaling the arrival of the Philistine. Pottery found at Philistines' archaeological sites, for example, appeared to have been made locally but looked strikingly like wares created by Aegean cultures such as the Mycenaeans, who built their civilization in what is now mainland Greece. And the Bible mentions Kaftor or Crete as the original place of the Philistines. Historians also know that around the time of these changes occur, the archaeological records civilizations in the Aegean and Eastern Mediterranean were collapsing. The Philistines were written about in Egyptian hieroglyphs, where they are referred to as the Peleset, among the tribes of sea peoples, said to have battled against Pharaoh Ramesses III around 1180 BC. Meanwhile, other scholars have suggested that the Philistines were in fact a local tribe or one that came from present-day Turkey or Syria. Now researchers have extracted DNA from the remains of 12 individuals, including 4 infants who were buried at Ashkelon during the Bronze Age and Iron Age. The results, which were published today in the Journal of Science Advances, suggest that the Philistines indeed migrated to the Middle East from southern Europe. This is an excellent example of a case where advances in science have helped us answer the question that has been long debated by archaeologists and ancient historians. So the new study seems from a discovery in 2013 of a cemetery with more than 200 burials contemporary with the Philistine settlement of Ashkelon. So, they can trace Philistine DNA back to southern Europe. And we have, hundreds of ancient Hebrews from the time of Jesus, Judeans, people from the southern kingdom, who are buried in catacombs in Rome, who are buried in catacombs in Israel, in ossuaries. They find bones. We can trace the Arabic people back to the ancient Canaanites. As I say here, Jews and Arabs share genetic link to ancient Canaanite study finds. Today's Jews and Arabs in Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, and parts of Syria get half their ancestry from Bronze Age Levantines who descend from a mix of local and migrants from Iran or the Caucasus. Most of today's Jewish and Arabic-speaking populations share a strong genetic link to the ancient Canaanites. A study by an international team of archaeologists and geneticists has found these modern-day groups in Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, and parts of Syria share a large part of their ancestry, in most cases more than half, with the people who lived in the Levant during the Bronze Age more than 3,000 years ago, the study concludes. So this doesn't prove anything, except that today's modern Jews and Arabs can link to Canaanites. We know that the land was full of Canaanites when the Israelites moved into there after exile in the wilderness. They moved back in with Joshua, and they destroyed some of the Canaanite cities like Jericho. And yet we cannot get any DNA from an ancient Israelite or Hebrew from the time of Jesus, with all of these archaeological finds that they have of tombs. I can't find online one genetic study of an ancient Hebrew burial site and where they've tested their DNA. It's all about modern Jews, Ashkenazi Jews, Sephardic Jews who can trace their genetics to this Levant Canaanite origin. When ancient DNA gets politicized, and this is about study of buried people at Ashkelon again, nothing to do with the ancient Hebrews. It's the Philistine city. No matter how many pages I scroll through on Wikipedia or on Google, I cannot find one study on ancient bones that are buried in a Hebrew grave or a Hebrew catacomb. Why not? I'm just asking this question. if they actually did a genetic study on actual Hebrew bones buried in a Hebrew burial site, that this would solve all these problems about origins of Kohanim and Ashkenazi Jews, or where today's descendants of the Hebrews are, but nobody's done a study. Let's once and for all clear up this problem. If I'm wrong about the lost tribes being from Europe, then I'm happy to eat humble pie. Let's find out whether the ancient Hebrews were actually black Israelites, or if the Jews of today are actually real Hebrew Israelites. Let's find out the truth by studying and doing a DNA test on some bones of Hebrew Israelites who were around at the time of Jesus or the Romans, because we know from the Bible that these people were real Israelites, were real people from the tribe of Judah. Now, they can study material late Chalcolithic period, 4,500 to 3,900 BC in the southern Levant, and they're getting DNA studies. They can get DNA from dinosaurs, and yet they can't get DNA from someone buried in Jerusalem back in the time of Jesus. Not one page, not one study. I can't find it anyway. Maybe somebody else knows of a study. We're only talking about 2,000 years ago. Caiaphas ossuary is one of the 12 ossuaries or bone boxes discovered in a burial cave in South Jerusalem, November 1990, 2 of which featured the name Caiaphas. Now, you would have to be careful that you weren't testing Idumean converts, of course. I don't know if they found bones in this ossuary. It has been suggested that it belonged to Joseph, son of Caiaphas, known as the high priest of Israel. Caiaphas in the New Testament. Here's a good one. 2,000-year-old ossuaries containing Jewish bones from the Second Temple period seized. In a joint operation conducted by the Shefet Police and the Israel Antiquities Authority, the ossuaries were allegedly plundered recently from a magnificent ancient burial cave in the Jerusalem region. A number of suspects were apprehended in the early hours of Friday, 28th of 3rd, in a joint operation by inspectors of the IAA Unit for the Prevention of Antiquities Robbery and detectives and patrolmen of the Shefet Police Station in Jerusalem. They were caught while in possession of 11 decorated stone ossuaries, ancient coffins that the Jewish population used for burial in the Second Temple period, 2,000 years ago. Some of the ossuaries still contain the skeletal remains of the deceased. The suspects, residents of Jerusalem's Tel Aviv and Arab village of Abidiah in the vicinity of Bethlehem, were caught red-handed by a team of patrolmen and detectives from Shefet Station in Jerusalem when they were closing a deal to sell the ossuaries to Jewish merchants near Hizma, checkpoint north of Jerusalem. Wow, why did Jewish merchants want the bones? Maybe they wanted to hide them away in some basement like they hide anything else that's important. The inspectors of the IAA Unit for the Prevention of Antiquities Robbery immediately recognized that these are special ancient ossuaries of unique significance. It is suspected the ossuaries were recently looted from an ancient burial cave in the region of Jerusalem. So here we have proof that we have actual bones in ossuaries in Jerusalem that can quite easily be tested for DNA, and then we would know the genetic origin of the ancient Israelites. That's if they weren't Idumean. So in the catacombs of Rome, we have the Jewish catacombs. Jewish Romer could take you underground the Jewish catacombs down a staircase of 7 steps to walk along the 400-meter long cubicola. You will be taken back to 22 centuries ago when the Jews moved to Rome and needed a land to bury their people. Through these findings, we can discover and understand the life of the first Jews in Rome, their cultural practices, and their social organization. The Jewish catacombs of ancient Rome. So you can't tell me that there's no bones in some of these catacombs. Ancient catacombs on Malta revealed Christians, Jews, and pagans were buried together. They could do DNA tests on some of these bones. 2012, the tomb exploration reveals the first archaeological evidence of Christianity from the time of Jesus. Examination by robotic camera of an Herodian-era tomb near Jerusalem has yielded ossuary engravings that strongly imply Christian culture, including an icon that seems to invoke the Jonah story. The most popular icon in 3rd century CE Roman tomb. Previously the earliest Christian image, the tomb is in close proximity to the controversial Jesus tomb, which contained an ossuary engraving Jesus, son of Joseph. And if you go and watch the channel Expedition Bible, you'll find that this story is not that controversial, that all of the scholars who were interviewed for the James Cameron movie about this all denied that this ossuary belonged to Jesus or to Jesus' family, and they were misquoted. But, I'm just trying to prove my point here that if we really want to solve this problem, we have DNA from dinosaurs or ancient animals. We have DNA from 3,000-year-old mummies. We have DNA from Philistines. We have DNA from Canaanites. And yet we cannot get a simple sample of Hebrew Israelite DNA when we have their bones in ossuaries. You go figure, because, apparently it's racist now to want to reveal the family origins of peoples, especially ancient peoples. What's so controversial about revealing some people who've been dead for 2,000 years? We're not offending anybody there out of that. We just want to know history. We want to know who these people were actually related to genetically, which family tree they come from. And we could solve a lot of arguments of problems if they actually did a test. But, I can't find anywhere online that anybody is doing DNA tests on ancient Jews from around the time of Roman Judea or the time of Jesus or even earlier. There's plenty of other burial sites of Israelite people, not Canaanites, not Amorites, Ammonites, not Philistines. We want an actual person who's been buried in an Israelite grave tested. So thanks for listening, everybody. I think this is an easy problem to solve if they just brought out the data on who these people actually are and where do the ancient Israelites come from and what family lineage do they or what haplotype do they belong to. It's not hard to solve, but nobody is doing it for some reason. So thanks again, everyone. Hope you enjoyed this video.